Given the horror genre's tendency for attention-grabbing stories, catchy titles, and iconic villains, is it that much of a surprise that so many great horror films have been remade for subsequent generations? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, especially if a modern filmmaker can offer a smart, unique spin on the original core premise. Conversely though, we all know how Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot Psycho remake was received. Oh boy. These 10 horror remakes, however, all decided to veer in wildly different directions from what came before, whether for better or for worse. So with that in mind, I am Gareth, this is What Culture Horror, and here are 10 horror movie remakes that were totally different. Number 10, House of Wax 2005. You'd be forgiven for assuming that 2005's House of Wax was a straight-up remake of the Vincent Price starring 1953 horror of the same name, in which Price plays a deranged sculptor who kills people and then coats them in wax to repopulate his destroyed wax museum. But ultimately, this is extremely close to being a remake in name only, as it actually has far more in common with the 1979 slasher Tourist Trap, where a group of youngsters stumble upon a roadside attraction and are consequently stalked by a killer residing there. In interviews, director Joe McCollett-Serra even admitted himself that the film is about as loose as remakes get, with Warner Brothers simply wanting to mine the brand name for some easy box office moolah. Though House of Wax was panned alongside the many classic horror remakes released around the same time, if you can accept how minimally it follows in the original's footsteps, it's actually a relatively well-crafted, nasty slice of self-aware horror. Number 9, Black Christmas 2019. Content warning, sexual assault will be mentioned in this entry. Bob Clark's legendary 1974 Yuletide slasher Black Christmas was first remade in 2006, and though that version offered its own distinct wrinkles on the original, it feels positively faithful compared to the most recent 2019 remake. While the 74 version of the film was a relatively grounded slasher flick in which a deranged murderer stalks a group of sorority girls around Christmas, the newest version misguidedly shifts the terror into supernatural territory. As it turns out, the sorority girls are targeted by murderous frat boys who get possessed by the spirit of the college's founder when they come into contact with a font of black goo hidden on campus. Yep, it's even sillier than it sounds. And while the intent to reimagine Black Christmas as a topical horror film about campus rape culture is filled with potential, the script is so embarrassingly clumsy as to render it basically moot. In addition to this, it's also rated PG-13, robbing it of even the most basic visceral thrills of the two prior iterations. Number 8, The Thing 1982. John Carpenter's 1982 The Thing is a reimagining of Christian Nyby's 1951 sci-fi horror The Thing from Another World, or rather a far more faithful adaptation of John W. Campbell's 1938 novella Who Goes There. Beyond the obvious aesthetic differences of the 51 movie being black and white, while the 82 remake is in colour, the original makes major changes to the novella by reimagining the Thing as a plant-like humanoid that requires blood to survive. The shape-shifting aspect of the remake and Campbell's source material, where the Thing can mimic any living thing it contacts, is nowhere to be seen in Nyby's original film. Also, the original has been widely interpreted as a thinly veiled allegory for America's fear of communism amid the Cold War, whereas the remake is often viewed as paralleling the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. Beyond all this, the Carpenter film also touts considerably more elaborate and grotesque effects, while the original lacks this gnarly body horror element. They're both solid films, but Carpenter's The Thing is in a whole other league, and without question one of the greatest remakes ever. Is it the greatest horror remake of all time? Well, if it's not, I want to know what is in the comment section down below. Number 7, Prom Knight 2008. While House of Wax managed to do something interesting by deviating from the original, 2008 Prom Knight is a remake that's different and yet no better for it. Beyond similarly involving a deranged murderer committing a killing spree on prom night, the remake has very little in common with the original 1980 Jamie Lee Curtis starring slasher. The motives of the killer are completely different here, and none of the characters are the same at all. Hell, not even a name. It is a textbook example of producers cynically dusting off a movie they own the rights to and stapling that branding onto an otherwise completely dull, forgettable film in an attempt to hoover up some easy box office bucks. And given that Prom Night 08 almost tripled its $20 million budget despite scathing reviews, it infuriatingly worked. Damn it! In the very least, the original film isn't really all that great either, so it's hardly a sacrilegious remake. That's something. Number 6, Susperia 2018. Luca Guadagnino's 2018 remake of Susperia, Dario Argento's legendary 1977 giallo film, is one of the most fascinating and worthwhile horror remakes of all time. In addition to its mesmerizing directorial craft and stunning performances, it also veers far away from the style and tone of the original, while retaining the basic dance school infested with witches premise. The most immediate change is the emphasis Guadagnino places on the setting, having the story unfold in 1977 Berlin in the midst of the German autumn, a spate of far-left terrorism that occurred during the height of the Cold War. Argento's film comparatively takes place in a bubble, with little exterior context beyond also being set in Germany. The remake also offers up a more in-depth and complex story, re The Witches, whereas the original is almost an entire hour shorter and therefore considerably more simple and streamlined. Aesthetically, Argento's film is famously extremely colourful and neon-tinged, while the remake strips this all away to be considerably more muted and oppressively dull, albeit intentionally so. Thank you very much for checking out this horror list today, my friend. If you're enjoying what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below and you'll get more of this what culture horror stuff in your eyes. Number 5, The Fly 1986. David Cronenberg's 1986 remake of 1958 sci-fi horror The Fly touts the same basic premise of a scientist being progressively transformed into a fly following an experiment gone wrong, but goes about it in a wildly different way. The 50s film is a considerably more restrained and demure stab at George Langeland's original short story, beginning with the protagonist's death and then going back to slowly unfurl the mystery of his demise. It's certainly effective in its own right, but Cronenberg's remake ditches the distinct 50s creature feature B-movie vibe of the original for a full-on, nauseatingly grotesque body horror film that spares absolutely no icky detail. Cronenberg lingers extensively on Seth Brundle's increasingly disgusting transformation into a man-fly hybrid, serving as a commentary on human fragility, while the 58 film is considerably less objectionable content-wise and lacks quite the same depth. The greater focus on romance in the remake between Brundle and his lover Veronica also imparts it with far more emotional resonance than the original. Now, they're both very good films, but this is a rare case of a decades later remake taking the core premise so much further. Number 4, The Invisible Man 2020. Lee Whannell's relatively recent adaptation of H.G. Wells' 1897 novel The Invisible Man couldn't feel much more different from James Whale's original 1933 film, with Whannell updating the story to reflect contemporary attitudes. In the 33 film, the title character, Dr. Jack Griffin, is a chemist who becomes invisible through experimental drugs, whereas in the remake, his equivalent, Adrian Griffin, is an optics specialist who creates a high-tech bodysuit which renders him invisible. As a result, Adrian can switch between being visible and invisible at will, simply by removing the suit, whereas in the original film, it was a permanent condition until he dies at the end of the story. Spoilers, I guess. Sorry about that. But the most pivotal difference between the two is Whannell's decision to center the story not around Adrian, but instead his partner Cecilia. As Cecilia is terrorized by Adrian, who fakes his own death while using the invisible suit to attack her, those closest to her believe her sanity is slipping, allowing Whannell to integrate a potent commentary on the Me Too movement into what could have been a straightforward genre film. Thankfully, they're both great movies, while tackling a superficially similar story in completely separate ways. Number 3, Day of the Dead 2008. Day of the Dead is generally accepted to be the lesser of George A. Romero's original Night of the Living Dead trilogy, but its esteem among horror fans has grown considerably since its 1985 release. Romero's original focused on a group of soldiers and scientists holed up in an underground bunker as the zombie apocalypse unfolds around them. In 2008, a loose, that is, very loose, remake was produced and penned by Final Destination writer Jeffrey Reddick. Beyond being a zombie movie centered around a group of military survivors with a third-act sequence set in a bunker, it has almost nothing in common with Romero's original. The social commentary just isn't there, and it lacks the oppressive tone of Romero's film. While likely only being produced in an attempt to cash in on Zack Snyder's well-received Dawn of the Dead remake released a few years prior, it's easy to believe that the script was written as an original zombie film and then just repurposed into a quasi-remake by a sneaky producer, as so little of the original's DNA Knight is actually present in this dreadfully naff, soulless remake. Day of the Dud more like. Number 2, Cat People, 1982. 1942's original Cat People, a horror centered around a woman who believes she will turn into a panther when sexually aroused, was produced in a more demure, creatively constrained era, where director Jacques Tourneur had to merely imply the story's sexual overtones. Now, it's certainly an envelope-pushing piece of work for its time, but for the 1982 remake, director Paul Schrader opted to eschew any and all subtlety whatsoever, delivering a scandalously sexy erotic horror that went to all the places the 42 film just couldn't. But Schrader's remake is far more than a mere sexed-up retelling filled with nudity and violence. It also takes the basic elemental premise of the original story and contorts it into a more twisted, melodramatic direction. Perhaps most notably, there's the inclusion of an incestual subplot by way of protagonist Irina's brother Paul, who wishes to mate with his sister. Lovely. Schrader also decides to explore the Cat People mythology in far greater detail, with some visually striking sequences depicting their origins. And additionally, there's the mesmerizing synth score from Giorgio Moroder, and title track by David Bowie himself, both of which help lend the remake a totally different flavor to its predecessor. And number 1, Carnival of Souls, 1998. Content warning, sexual assault will be mentioned in this entry. Carnival of Souls is a classic 1962 low-budget horror in which a young woman, Mary Henry, is terrorized by haunting imagery following a car accident. In 1998, a low-budget remake, executive produced by Wes Craven, was released. Though beyond its title, it bears only the most superficial similarities to its predecessor. The story instead follows a woman, Alex Grant, who is stalked by the murderous clown who raped and killed her mother years prior. Beyond the fact that both protagonists are involved in car accidents, which tee up the same plot twist at the end, and carnivals being a setting, the bulk of each film is markedly different. The imagery and ideas in the original are mere window dressing for this baffling remake, which ultimately coasts on Craven's inexplicable involvement and needlessly throws rape into a film that really didn't need it. Best to forget this one ever happened.